She lifted the mold from the icebox and turned it upside down onto the platter, not knowing whether the shrimp ring inside would hold or collapse in front of 12 guests. What was actually on that 1950s buffet table, and why did every trace of it disappear? The 1950s dinner party was not a casual gathering, it was choreography. A hostess planned the cocktail hour, the canapes, the molded salad, the main course, and the dessert as separate acts of a single evening, and every dish on that table was a quiet demonstration of skill, timing, and a brand new post-war kitchen. This is the world these 30 dishes came from, and it is worth understanding before we laugh at any of them. Start with the dish that defined the era more than any other: tomato aspic, tomato juice, gelatin, a little lemon, and vegetables suspended in perfect symmetry, chilled for hours, and unmolded onto a lettuce leaf like a jewel. It looks strange to us now, but it required real technique, and a hostess who could unmold one cleanly, without a crack, had earned something like a small trophy. Right beside it sat the shrimp ring in tomato gelatin, a showpiece built for the center of the table. Cooked shrimp arranged in a perfect circle inside a ring mold, the gelatin poured slowly so nothing shifted, then chilled overnight. When the mold came off clean, it caught candlelight like glass. This was not a shortcut dish. It demanded patience and a very steady hand. None of this was possible before refrigerators became common in ordinary homes. By 1950, close to 90% of American households in cities and suburbs owned a mechanical refrigerator, up from under half just a decade earlier. That single appliance changed what a party could be, and gelatin salads exploded, not because taste had changed, but because the technology to make them finally had. Ham mousse belongs on this list too, a savory cousin of the sweet gelatin desserts. Ground ham folded with mayonnaise, gelatin, and a whisper of mustard, set in a fish-shaped or fluted mold and served cold as a first course. It was rich, it was pink, and it was proof that a hostess could turn a pantry staple into something that looked like it came from a hotel kitchen. Before dinner came the cocktail hour, and the cocktail hour had its own entirely separate menu. Canapes were small, elegant, 1 or 2 bites, meant to be eaten standing up with a drink in the other hand. A proper hostess never served cocktail hour food at the dinner table and never served dinner food during cocktails. The two were distinct rituals, each with its own rules. Ritz crackers were the workhorse of that cocktail hour. Nabisco had launched them in 1934, and by the 1950s, the box itself carried recipe suggestions, dozens of spreads and toppings a hostess could pile on in under an hour. Deviled ham, pimento cheese, liverwurst, a single olive slice. The genius of the Ritz Canape was that it looked composed even when it took no time at all. The cheese ball deserves its own moment of respect. Cream cheese blended with sharp cheddar, Worcestershire, and a little onion formed by hand into a perfect sphere, then rolled in chopped walnuts or parsley until it looked upholstered. It sat on the buffet table like a centerpiece, and a hostess would present it whole, letting guests cut the first slice themselves as a small social ceremony. Deviled eggs were nearly universal, but the 1950s version was more elaborate than what we make today. Yolks blended with mayonnaise, mustard, and a dash of paprika piped through a pastry bag into perfect rosettes rather than simply spooned in. Some hostesses tinted the filling pale pink or green for a holiday party. It was a small dish that still demanded a steady, decorative hand. Pigs in a blanket existed long before the crescent roll version most of us grew up with. In the 1950s, it meant a cocktail franc wrapped in a simple pastry or biscuit dough, baked until golden, and served hot on a toothpick straight from the oven. It was one of the few cocktail hour foods that was warm, and guests would gather near the kitchen door just to catch a fresh batch. Rumaki belonged to a stranger, more exotic corner of 1950s entertaining. Chicken liver and water chestnut wrapped in bacon, skewered and broiled until crisp. It came from a wave of Polynesian and Tiki-inspired party themes that swept suburban America after the war, as returning servicemen brought back a fascination with the Pacific. A Rumaki platter meant a hostess was doing something bold. California dip has a surprisingly exact birthday. Sour cream stirred with Lipton's dry onion soup mix. First printed as a suggested recipe right on the back of the soup mix box in the early to mid-1950s. It became one of the fastest-spreading recipes in American history simply because it traveled home in millions of grocery bags. No cookbook required, no magazine subscription needed. Green bean casserole did not come from anyone's grandmother. It was invented in 1955 by Dorcas Rayleigh, a home economist working in the Campbell Soup Company test kitchen in Camden, New Jersey, built specifically to show off a can of cream of mushroom soup. The original recipe card still exists today, preserved in an inventor's archive, a strange and wonderful fact for a dish so many families believe is a century-old tradition. Campbell's cream of mushroom soup was not just one recipe, it was the base of an entire cooking philosophy. Home economists at food companies designed casseroles specifically to be built around a single can, and magazines printed the results as if they were folk recipes. Tuna noodle, chicken divan, scalloped potatoes, dozens of dishes shared the same foundation, engineered in a corporate test kitchen and marketed as homemade comfort. The word convenience meant something different in the 1950s than it does now. A can of soup or a box of gelatin was not seen as lazy. It was seen as modern, even scientific, the product of laboratories and progress. A hostess who built her party around Jell-O and Campbell's was not cutting corners in the eyes of her guests. She was showing that she kept an efficient, up-to-date household. Spam earned its place at the party table too, especially in the Midwest and in Hawaii, where it became deeply woven into local food culture after the war. Sliced, glazed with brown sugar and mustard, sometimes studded with cloves, and baked until the edges caramelized, it was served as a main-course centerpiece at potlucks and buffet dinners, treated with the same care a ham roast would get. Miracle Whip quietly took over the American pantry during these years. Kraft had introduced it back in 1933, but by the 1950s it had overtaken plain mayonnaise as the default binder in ham salad, potato salad, and nearly every congealed dish on the buffet table. Kraft marketed it as sweeter, tangier, more modern than mayonnaise, and most hostesses simply reached for it without a second thought. Waldorf salad, in its 1950s form, was served differently than most people remember. Apples, celery, and walnuts bound in mayonnaise, but spooned neatly into a single lettuce cup on an individual salad plate, not tossed loose in a bowl. That lettuce cup mattered enormously in the etiquette of the era. It signaled a plated, formal course rather than something scooped from a communal dish. Canned fruit cocktail, spooned into stemmed sherbet glasses and chilled, was a common first course, especially for a ladies' luncheon rather than an evening party. It was simple. It was pretty in the glass, and it let a hostess start the meal with something bright and cold before heavier courses arrived. Sometimes a single maraschino cherry sat on top, placed there by hand, one glass at a time. Pineapple, cream cheese, and chopped olive canapes sound like an odd combination now, but the pairing of sweet and salty was considered sophisticated. Cream cheese softened and blended with crushed pineapple and finely chopped stuffed olives spread on crackers or tiny toast rounds. It showed up at bridge club gatherings and afternoon coffees as often as evening cocktail parties. Liverwurst Pate balls were the more elegant cousin of the cheese ball. Liverwurst softened and blended with cream cheese and a little brandy or sherry, shaped into a mound, then coated in chopped parsley or crushed nuts to hide the seams. It sat on the buffet table with a small silver spreader beside it, and a hostess who served it was signaling a slightly more continental taste than her neighbors. Stuffed celery was a small, unglamorous dish that appeared at almost every gathering anyway. Celery ribs filled with pimento cheese or cream cheese and chives, cut into short lengths, arranged fanned out on a relish tray. It was the dish nobody bragged about, the reliable filler between the showpieces, and it is exactly the kind of small ritual that has vanished most completely from modern tables. Shrimp cocktail, served the 1950s way, was theater. A stemmed glass lined with shredded lettuce, Chilled cooked shrimp hung over the rim, and a separate small cup of cocktail sauce nestled in the center, usually built with ketchup, horseradish, and a dash of lemon. It was a first course meant to be photographed by the eye before it was eaten, and it announced that the evening was a genuinely formal one. Cheese straws were a Southern staple that traveled well beyond the South by the 1950s. Sharp cheddar worked into a butter and flour dough, pressed through a cookie press into long, thin ribbons, and baked until crisp. They were stored in tin canisters and pulled out for every drop-in guest, because unlike most party food, cheese straws kept for days without losing their character. Ambrosia Salad blurred the line between side dish and dessert, and that was exactly the point. Canned mandarin oranges, shredded coconut, marshmallows, and sometimes crushed pineapple folded together in whipped cream or sour cream served chilled in a glass bowl. It showed up on Easter and Christmas tables constantly, sweet enough to satisfy a sweet tooth while still technically counting as a salad course. Welsh Rarebit found its way onto more American cocktail menus than people remember today. A rich sauce of melted sharp cheese, beer or ale, mustard, and Worcestershire, poured hot over toast points, served from a chafing dish so it stayed warm through the whole party. It required a hostess to manage heat and timing in front of her guests, which made it feel like a small performance every time she served it. The chafing dish itself deserves a mention because it was the true workhorse of a 1950s formal buffet. A small flame under a water bath kept hot dips, cream dishes, and meatballs at serving temperature for hours without the hostess ever leaving her guests to reheat something in the kitchen. Owning a good silver chafing dish set was itself a small marker of a household that entertained seriously. Swedish meatballs in a cream sauce, kept warm in exactly that kind of chafing dish, became one of the most requested buffet dishes of the decade. Small, tender, simmered in a sauce, built from beef broth and cream, speared with toothpicks for easy eating while standing. It traveled from Midwestern Scandinavian communities into mainstream entertaining almost entirely through word of mouth between neighbors and church groups. Deviled ham pinwheels turned a humble canned spread into something that looked handcrafted. Thin slices of white bread flattened with a rolling pin, spread edge to edge with deviled ham, rolled tightly, chilled, then sliced into small pinwheel rounds. The visual trick mattered more than the ingredients. A canned product transformed into something that looked like it took real bakery skill. A proper 1950s hostess almost never served all 30 of these dishes at once, and that restraint was part of the skill. A good party menu balanced one showpiece gelatin, 2 or 3 canapes, a warm chafing dish item, and a simple dessert, never more. Overloading the table was considered a mistake, a sign a hostess did not trust her own choices enough to edit them down. Better Homes and Gardens published its new cookbook in 1930 and revised it heavily through the 1950s, and that single volume shaped what an ordinary American woman believed a proper party menu should look like. It sat on more kitchen counters than almost any other book of the decade. Its Canapes chapter alone dictating cocktail hour trends in towns that never saw a single magazine advertisement. Jell-O ran contests through the 1950s inviting homemakers to submit their own molded salad creations, and the company mailed out recipe booklets by the truckload. It turned an ordinary gelatin box into something closer to a competitive craft, women comparing molds and techniques the way another era might compare quilts. The prize was rarely large, but the bragging rights at the next Bridge Club meeting mattered more. Magazine advertising quietly shaped nearly every recipe printed in the era's biggest publications. Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, and Better Homes and Gardens all carried heavy sponsorship from Jell-O, Kraft, Campbell's, and Carnation evaporated milk, and the recipes they printed often leaned toward those exact brand products as a condition of the advertising relationship. A hostess reading her favorite magazine was, without knowing it, reading a very polished sales pitch. The typical cost of hosting a full cocktail party for 12 to 16 guests in the mid-1950s, once you counted the liquor, the Canape ingredients, and a bakery cake ran somewhere in the range of $15 to $25, a figure food historians treat as a rough estimate rather than an exact number. Even so, it tells you something important. Entertaining well was genuinely within reach of an ordinary middle-class household. Onion dip aside, sour cream itself became a quiet star ingredient across dozens of these dishes, valued for the way it held flavor without breaking down the way plain cream did. It bound dips, softened frostings, thickened casserole toppings, and smoothed out gelatin salads. A tub of sour cream sitting in the icebox on a Saturday afternoon was often the first sign that company was coming that evening. A hostess in this decade never served herself first, and she rarely sat down for long stretches during her own party. Her job, as etiquette columns of the era described it plainly, was to keep every glass filled, every plate refreshed, and every guest engaged in conversation, all while appearing completely unhurried. The performance of effortlessness was, itself, one of the hardest parts of the whole evening. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart. Which dish went out first? Which guest's glass needed refilling before they even noticed it was empty? How long to let the cheese ball sit at room temperature before it was spreadable? None of it appeared in any etiquette book. It passed from mother to daughter, or from one careful observation of a neighbor's party to the next. Punch bowls deserve real credit here, because the punch itself was often the centerpiece of the whole cocktail hour. A large cut glass bowl, a block of ice, or a frozen ring mold, with fruit suspended inside floating at the center, and a ladle guests used to serve themselves. It solved a real hosting problem, letting guests mingle and pour their own drinks instead of pulling the hostess away from her other duties all evening. Nuts, always in a small dish, always salted, sat on nearly every coffee table and side table during cocktail hour, refilled quietly whenever a hostess passed by. It was such a small detail that almost nobody wrote about it, and yet it was considered a basic requirement. A party without a nut dish, somewhere in reach, was considered slightly unprepared, no matter how elaborate everything else on the table looked. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Recipe boxes, index cards written in fading pencil, handed down not because anyone thought they were historically important, but simply because throwing them away felt wrong. Most of what we know about these 30 dishes survives in exactly that kind of scattered, informal record, not in official archives, but in kitchen drawers across the country. Molded vegetable salads, distinct from the tomato aspic, used a plain, unflavored gelatin base from Knox rather than a sweetened Jell-O flavor. Shredded cabbage, grated carrot, and diced celery suspended in a lightly seasoned, savory gelatin, unmolded onto a bed of lettuce. Knox had published its own recipe pamphlets since the 1930s, and by the 1950s the unflavored route was considered the more sophisticated choice among serious hostesses. Stuffed mushroom caps were a later 1950s arrival, but they spread fast once they appeared in magazines. Mushroom caps filled with a mixture of breadcrumbs, the chopped mushroom stems, butter, and a little sherry, baked until golden and served hot on a tray. They required more prep than most canapes, and a hostess who served them was signaling that she had spent real time in the kitchen that afternoon. Bacon-wrapped water chestnuts, sometimes called devils on horseback in older cookbooks when made with dates instead, showed up constantly at cocktail parties. Because they solved a practical problem, they could be assembled hours ahead and broiled at the very last minute. A hostess could have a full tray ready in the icebox by mid-afternoon and simply slide it under the broiler as guests arrived. Consomme, served chilled and slightly jellied in small cups, was a genuinely elegant first course for a warm-weather dinner party. Clarified beef or chicken broth, seasoned carefully, chilled until it set into a soft spoonable jelly, served with a small wedge of lemon on the side. It required real technical patience to clarify the broth properly, and it was considered a mark of a hostess with genuine cooking skill. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, and that is true of more of these dishes than we tend to admit. A well-made chilled consomme or a properly balanced ham mousse is not a relic of bad taste. It is a technique that fell out of fashion because the whole ritual around it fell out of fashion, not because the food itself stopped being good. Cheese and crackers on a relish tray sound almost too simple to mention, but the arrangement itself followed strict unspoken rules. Sharp cheddar cut into cubes, a soft spreadable cheese in its own small crock, crackers fanned in a specific pattern around the edge. A relish tray thrown together carelessly was noticed immediately by guests, even if nobody ever said a word about it out loud. Deviled crab, spooned back into cleaned crab shells and baked until the top browned, was a coastal specialty that traveled inland through military families stationed near the water during and after the war. Lump crab meat, mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, mustard, and a little cream, baked in individual shells for an elegant single-serving presentation that made even a simple dinner feel like a special occasion. A hostess gift of a small box of chocolates or a bottle of good sherry was expected etiquette when a guest arrived. And a proper hostess kept a small drawer or shelf specifically for storing these gifts until after the party, never opening them in front of the giver unless invited to. It was a quiet, formal exchange that most modern guests would find surprisingly rigid today. Olive and cream cheese pinwheels followed the same rolled bread technique as the deviled ham version, but with a milder, tangier filling built from cream cheese and chopped green olives. They were considered slightly more refined than the ham version, often reserved for a ladies' luncheon rather than a mixed evening cocktail party, and they were almost always served on the smallest, most delicate serving plate a household owned. Frosted grapes, dipped in beaten egg white and rolled in sugar until they looked coated in frost, sat on dessert plates and on the edges of cheese boards as a decorative garnish as much as a food. They caught light beautifully under a chandelier, and a hostess would prepare a whole bunch, then pluck a few off at a time as she arranged each finished plate. Baked Alaska made its grand entrance at the most formal 1950s dinner parties, a genuine showstopper. Sponge cake topped with ice cream, covered entirely in meringue, then briefly baked or flamed at the table so the inside stayed frozen while the outside browned. It required real culinary confidence to pull off in front of guests, and when it worked, it was the single moment of the evening everyone remembered. Not every showpiece succeeded. Etiquette columns of the era occasionally reference the quiet disaster of a collapsed mold or a scorched meringue, and hostesses developed backup plans, a second simpler dessert kept ready just in case. The fear of a dish failing in front of guests was real and constant, which is part of why these recipes were guarded and practiced so carefully before the actual party night. Divinity Candy, a fluffy white confection of beaten egg whites, sugar syrup, and chopped nuts, appeared on dessert trays, especially around the winter holidays. It demanded precise sugar syrup temperature and perfect timing while beating the egg whites, a recipe that punished any shortcut immediately with a grainy, failed batch, which made a successful tray of it a genuine point of pride. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, and a surprising amount of that skill lived in small, deliberate details. The exact placement of a candle, the specific dish set out first to greet arriving guests, the temperature of the room adjusted before anyone walked in. None of these details were flashy on their own, but together they built an entire atmosphere before a single word of conversation began. Fondue, as most of us picture it, a communal pot of melted cheese with bread cubes on long forks, was not really a 1950s party staple at all. That craze belongs more accurately to the years after the 1964 World's Fair, when Swiss fondue sets became a fashionable wedding gift. The 1950s hosted its own version of communal hot food, but it lived in that chafing dish dip, not a fondue pot. Ribbon sandwiches, thin layers of white and pumpernickel bread alternated with colorful fillings and pressed together into a loaf, then sliced crosswise to reveal a striped pattern, were the showpiece of a proper afternoon tea. They took real time to assemble the day before a party and were sliced fresh right before guests arrived, so the pattern stayed crisp and clean when served. Bridge Club luncheons deserve a mention of their own because they generated an entire subcategory of these party dishes. Small, dainty plated food meant to be eaten one-handed between rounds of cards, chicken salad in a lettuce cup, a single deviled egg, a tiny frosted cake square. The card table itself often doubled as the dining table, with a lace cloth thrown over it just for the afternoon. Angel food cake, light and pale, and baked in a specific tube pan designed just for it, was the go-to dessert when a hostess wanted something impressive but not heavy after a rich dinner. Beaten egg whites alone gave it its structure. No butter, no yolks, which made it notoriously easy to deflate if the oven door opened too early, another small technical trap a good hostess learned to avoid. Cocktail meatballs in a sweet and tangy sauce, often built from grape jelly and chili sauce simmered together, became a later 1950s and early 1960s crowd favorite precisely because they were nearly impossible to mess up. They held their temperature well in a chafing dish. They were easy to eat with a single toothpick, and the sweet savory sauce appealed to nearly every guest at the party. Ice cream molds, frozen into decorative shapes using metal molds meant specifically for that purpose, turned an ordinary dessert into something worth admiring before it was even served. A baume mold, a fluted ring, sometimes even a holiday shape like a bell or a star, packed with layered ice cream and frozen solid, then unmolded briefly under warm water right before the dessert course. A hostess kept a running mental list, sometimes an actual written one, tracking which dishes she had served to which guests over the past several parties. Specifically so, she never repeated a dish for the same crowd twice in a row. Repetition was considered a small failure of imagination, and a truly respected hostess in her social circle was known for never serving the same centerpiece dish twice in a season. The parlor remembers, even when we forget. And that is really what this whole list has been about. Every one of these 30 dishes carried a small piece of social meaning, a signal about effort, taste, modernity, or care that guests read instinctively the moment they walked in the door. We lost the dishes, but more than that, we lost the fluency to read a room the way these women once could. Nutrition science began shifting in the following decades, and much of it worked against these dishes directly. Concerns about sodium in canned goods, fat content in mayonnaise-based salads, and the processed nature of gelatin and canned meats all grew steadily through the 1960s and 70s, turning what had once been symbols of modern efficiency into symbols of an outdated, less health-conscious era. The formal dinner party itself began to fade well before the food did. As more households gained a second car, as suburbs sprawled farther from each other, and as television replaced the parlor as the evening's gathering point, the entire structured ritual of an evening built around courses and canapes simply had fewer occasions to happen. The dishes did not vanish first, the ritual around them did. By the 1970s and 80s, the gelatin mold had shifted from status symbol to punchline, appearing in cookbooks and magazine retrospectives as an example of dated, even slightly absurd taste. It is worth remembering that this reversal says far more about shifting cultural values than it does about the actual skill or care that went into making one properly in the first place. In recent years, a genuine wave of renewed curiosity about these dishes has surfaced again, largely online, as people rediscover vintage cookbooks and archival food photography. Some of it is affectionate nostalgia, some of it leans toward ironic camp. But either way, it means these 30 dishes are being looked at, discussed, and in some cases actually cooked again for the first time in decades. Food historians and museum programs at state historical societies now use these exact 1950s party menus as case studies, examining how post-war appliance technology, gender roles, and consumer advertising all collided on a single buffet table. What looks quaint to a casual viewer is, to a historian, a genuinely rich document of how an entire generation of American women navigated status, creativity, and domestic expectation. There is a real backlash today against takeout on the couch, a genuine hunger for slower, more intentional hosting, and that is exactly why these 30 dishes still have something to teach us. Nobody needs to unmold a tomato aspic in 2026, but the underlying instinct behind it, thoughtful preparation, a table set with real care, a host who is fully present, that instinct is worth reviving completely intact. If you had to guess which of these 30 dishes would survive another 50 years, the honest answer is probably the ones with the least technical risk. The cheese ball, the deviled egg, the onion dip born on the back of a soup box. The elaborate showpieces, the aspics and mouses and molded ice creams, required a kind of patient confidence that modern entertaining rarely asks of anyone anymore. What strikes me most, looking back across all 30 of these dishes, is how much intention lived inside, even the smallest gesture, a piped rosette on a deviled egg, a fanned relish tray, a punch bowl ring frozen with fruit, suspended just so. None of it was necessary for survival. All of it was necessary for connection, for making an ordinary evening feel like it mattered to the people sitting around that table. These 30 dishes were never really about the food itself. They were about a woman standing in her own kitchen, deciding that an ordinary Tuesday evening deserved real effort, real care, and a table set with something worth remembering. That is the part of the 1950s dinner party worth bringing back, whether or not you ever unmold a single tomato aspic in your own kitchen again. If any of these 30 dishes reminded you of your own mother's kitchen, or your grandmother's recipe box, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me which one you remember, and which one you think deserves to come back to the table. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and every story you share helps keep a little more of it alive. If you loved stepping back into this world with me, subscribe to Clara's Forgotten Parlor, because there are so many more rooms in this house left to explore. The table settings nobody teaches anymore, the cocktail hour customs that vanished, the calling cards and thank you notes that once held an entire social world together. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, and I will keep bringing you back into that room, one forgotten evening at a time.